Welcome back to Unfair Housing. I'm Morgan Cardinal. Today I'll be discussing realtors and real estate agents and their role in shaping housing segregation in our communities. As a reminder, this podcast is not meant to be an exhaustive discussion of the history of housing segregation and housing discrimination, nor is it meant to create division or instill guilt, but rather to educate our listeners on what shaped our neighborhoods and our social perspectives, so we can be better guided in our efforts to improve our future and avoid repeating the mistakes of our past. We welcome your comments and lively discussion on the topics we raise, but we ask that you use kindness and consideration when making and responding to comments, and that you refrain from using threatening or violent language. Okay, so let's get into it. You may recall from past episodes, we mentioned realtors and real estate agents and their involvement in housing segregation. For instance, they were heavily involved in blockbusting practices, which helped spur white flight and the use of predatory installment contracts. They were also instrumental in developing racial zoning, neighborhood rules, and restrictive covenants to exclude Black Americans from the suburbs. A major player in segregating American neighborhoods was Duncan McDuffie of California. He started his career as a realtor, but moved into real estate development not long after. McDuffie was also a prominent figure in California politics and racial zoning, which he used to keep his developments all white, and not just in housing, but local businesses too. He is largely responsible for developing Berkeley, California, and its adoption of public zoning codes that allowed Berkeley city officials to close many Black and Asian-owned businesses once the code was implemented. After racial zoning was declared unconstitutional in Buchanan versus Warley, McDuffie moved on to using restrictive covenants and HOA rules to segregate. You may also recall J.C. Nichols, who we discussed in episode 2. He began his career as a realtor, then, like McDuffie, moved into real estate development, particularly in developing the suburbs. Nichols used restrictive covenants and HOA rules to ensure homes were not sold to Black buyers. Nichols was particularly influential in creating homeowners associations that became largely responsible for implementing restrictive covenants and discriminatory rules to maintain all white neighborhoods. The use of restrictive covenants and HOA rules led to a system that created segregated neighborhoods and essentially kept Black residents out of the newly developed suburbs. Homeowners living in developments with HOAs were put in the position to either perpetuate racial discrimination and contribute to furthering patterns of housing segregation, or face a lawsuit from their neighbor or HOA for failing to comply with neighborhood rules designed to keep Black families out. McDuffie and Nichols were very popular in the real estate community in their day. And despite the fact that their practices run afoul of modern fair housing laws, both continued to be celebrated for their contributions in modern times. Up until 2020, the Urban Land Institute's highest praise was the Award for Visionaries in Urban Development, named after J.C. Nichols. And to this day, Duncan McDuffie has a mountain in California named after him. When restrictive covenants were outlawed in Shelley v. Kramer, developers like Nichols and McDuffie turned to realtors to engage in discriminatory housing practices to keep their neighborhoods white. Realtors created their whole business structure to exclude Black families from new housing opportunities and force them into segregated neighborhoods, which included establishing a perspective on personal freedom adopted by many that is still part of politics today. Most of us are probably familiar with the term realtor and associate it with someone who helps us buy or sell a home, or maybe helps us locate rental property. More specifically, realtors are members of a business trade organization that is only available to private individuals who are licensed and pay dues. But realtors and real estate agents also hold great influence over the real estate industry, real estate legislation, and the general public. In the early years, realtors had great influence in the development of all real estate practices and procedures, from appraisals, subdivision and home development, rental and property management, and in educating all real estate professionals, not just realtors. In fact, many realtors, like J.C. Nichols and Duncan McDuffie, extended their work in real estate beyond sales and became the largest real estate developers in the country, eventually forming the National Home Builders Association. Long after restrictive covenants had been outlawed by the Supreme Court, realtors, in partnership with other industry-related professionals and government actors, kept Black Americans out of 95% of the country's neighborhoods, and 98% were excluded from new homes well into the 1960s. A key element to accomplishing this separation was ingraining in the minds of society, industry professionals, and the government the false belief the presence of Black Americans in a neighborhood lowered property values, and convincing these groups they had freedom to discriminate. Two of the earliest formed real estate boards that were responsible for pushing these points of view were formed in Chicago and Los Angeles, and unfortunately, both had significant influence over the practices adopted by the National Association of Real Estate Exchanges, which was later referred to as the National Association of Real Estate Boards, and known today as the National Association of Realtors. Chicago wasn't always segregated, certainly not as segregated as it was in 1957 when it gained the title as the most segregated city in the country. As Southern Blacks migrated to the city, white Chicagoans were uncomfortable with the influx, so they developed ways to keep Black Americans out of their neighborhoods. One was through violence. Between the summer of 1917 and the spring of 1921, 58 homes rented or owned by Black Chicagoans were bombed. Another tactic was with the assistance of the Chicago Real Estate Board, or CREB, which organized neighborhood improvement associations. These associations pressured white homeowners to refuse to sell to Black home buyers. As migration of Southern Blacks increased, CREB wanted to confine the newcomers to neighborhoods that already housed majority Black families. In addition to forming neighborhood improvement associations, CREB organized block clubs. The clubs were created to keep homes in white neighborhoods from being sold to Black buyers, and instead ensure Black buyers only purchase homes in Black neighborhoods chosen by CREB. CREB went so far as to officially decree this business tactic as a requirement for its members, and memorialized its stance on segregation in its Code of Ethics, which forbade the sale of property to any person whose ownership would cause adjoining properties to depreciate. Soon after CREB took this action, realtor boards across the country followed suit, looking to CREB for guidance on how to replicate Chicago's discriminatory housing practices. And it was CREB's business practice that influenced the National Association to incorporate racially discriminatory language into its mandatory ethics code in 1924. So it likely comes as no surprise that CREB also excluded Black real estate agents from its membership, and of course, so did the National Association. By 1960, there were 80,000 realtors in the U.S. None were Black. Instead, Black real estate agents had to form their own board and were known as realists. This meant Black agents could not access the home sale listings established by the National Association system, which you might know as the Multiple Listing Service, or MLS. Consequently, this meant Black realists could not sell homes in white neighborhoods to Black buyers, helping to maintain realtors' coveted neighborhood conformity. Also predating the National Association, the Los Angeles Realty Board, LARB, was established in 1903, 20 years after CREB. However, LARB became the largest real estate board in the country and was responsible for forming the California state agency that controlled all future formed local boards. Together, the state of California housed more than half of all realtors. Unlike in Chicago, California's discriminatory real estate practices were not in response to an influx of minorities. Instead, these practices created separate markets based on race and turned already integrated neighborhoods into segregated neighborhoods by preventing minorities' access to new developments and leaving behind designated areas where Black Californians were allowed to live. LARB was originally formed to address the lack of professional standards and public trust in the real estate industry, at least as far as the white housing market was concerned. Membership dues were set high for members based on the belief wealth meant a member had high morals, a position strongly supported by one of its founders and two-time serving National Association president William Garland. As it turns out, Garland was extremely influential in shaping federal housing programs following World War I. He served in the Department of Labor's Bureau of Industrial Housing and Transportation and recruited other realtors and real estate professionals, including Duncan McDuffie, to hold government jobs. We'll get into realtor influence and their role in property assessment for the federal government a bit more later in the episode. In its early stages, LARB was extremely influential in California politics. Realtors believed the rules that governed their profession would be more effective if coupled with supporting legislation, at least in certain circumstances. We'll discuss later where this correlation broke down. So LARB members lobbied the city of Los Angeles to pass an ordinance that prohibited the sale of real estate on the sidewalk, which was common practice in the early 1900s. And they pushed for a state licensing law that would require all board members to both obtain a license to sell real estate and abide by certain policies and practices. LARB was also largely responsible for making Los Angeles the first city to implement zoning that limited the height of buildings and where residential properties could be located. The code created industrial zones and residential zones, which did not allow businesses to be located in residential zones, forcing some already established businesses to close. From a realtor's perspective, taking away an individual property owner's freedom to do whatever they wanted with their property was overridden by what was best for the community. This is an interesting argument considering realtors took the opposite approach to individual freedom when steering public opinion toward supporting housing segregation. In the early to mid 1900s, realtors were generally adamantly against fair housing laws. California realtors led early opposition to open housing opportunities for all and focused on an individual's freedom and their right to choose. Led by the leader of the California Real Estate Association's president, Spike Wilson, realtors at this time believed freedom was a homeowner's right to choose who to sell their home to, and that freedom, in this sense, was something that should be preserved, not taken away. Realtors also believed being protected from discriminatory housing practices was a privilege, not a right. So being able to choose who you sell your home to was a right, but protections from being kept out of housing for reasons one had no control over were not. And interestingly, realtors' push to preserve the freedom to discriminate was primarily focused on government oppression of homeowners. Realtors, particularly in California, felt fair housing protections for minorities were equivalent to forced housing for all. That by giving rights to one group meant an equivalent loss of rights for another group, and it needed to be stopped. In the late 1940s and 50s, the argument of personal freedom developed into an argument around the freedom of association, meaning the freedom to live near others who looked like you. California's first major attack on fair housing policy was Proposition 14, a 1964 ballot initiative drafted to replace the 1963 Rumford Fair Housing Act, a law that prohibited housing discrimination based on color. The purpose of Proposition 14 was to restore the individual freedom of homeowners to choose who they sold or rented their home to. This was accomplished by keeping both the state and local governments from passing any law that limited the ability to discriminate in housing. Disturbingly, the constitutional amendment passed with ease, and the right to freely discriminate became part of California's constitution. Following its passage, the law faced two challenges, and ultimately the California Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court both held Proposition 14 was unconstitutional because it basically meant the state was giving permission to Californians to discriminate at their will when renting and selling real estate. The United States Supreme Court reasoned this was essentially equivalent to the state giving private individuals the right to discriminate without concern or worry some government body would step in to prevent the discrimination. The court determined it was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and therefore could not stand. But what the passage of Proposition 14 did accomplish, both in California and across the country by those who observed California's position on fair housing laws, was help spread the idea of an individual's freedom to choose who to sell or rent their home to, and ingrain the idea of that right in the minds of everyday Americans. Remember, up to this point, several tactics had been used to segregate American neighborhoods that were later ruled unconstitutional. But just as in those instances, simply overruling them in the courts did not change the neighborhood boundaries they created, nor did it change the mindset of many Americans, including realtors and real estate agents. The basis for and impacts of those practices remained. The same was true with Proposition 14. We'll leave it there for this week, and we'll pick back up next week with a discussion on the National Association of Real Estate Boards and the influence of realtors on federal policy and programs, and revisit blockbusting. Remember, if you or someone you know is experiencing housing discrimination, or if you would like to schedule a fair housing training, contact our Fair Housing Unit at 800-875-8785. To see if you qualify for any other legal assistance, contact CLS Helpline at 800-405-1417. And don't forget, give us a like and a follow, and please share the series with your friends and family. Also be sure to follow CLS on Instagram, Facebook, and X. Until next time.